Hello and welcome to Harry Cole Saves the West, the show where American grit meets British backbone. In New York, socialist firebrand Zohran Mamdani is on the brink of power, with tomorrow's election expected to make him the next mayor of New York City. But should we judge a man by the company he keeps? A major foreign interference row has exploded, with Jeremy Corbyn, once Britain's Labour leader but kicked out for anti-Semitism. He's now actively campaigning for Mamdani with a paid-for calling campaign from the UK. As Texas Senator Ted Cruz put it, a British anti-Semite supporting a New York anti-Semite. Communists of the world, unite. Tonight, in DC, live with us is Harmeet Dhillon, the Assistant US Attorney General and the political editor of The Spectator, Tim Shipman. Assistant Attorney General, thank you for joining us. This isn't the first time this has happened in British and American relations, where a political party or a politician has intervened in a live election race. Can I get your response to that? You were tweeting about this last night, and it's caused quite a storm back in Britain.
Well, you know, in the last few election cycles, in the federal elections we've had, there's been allegations of election interference, first to try to derail President Trump's 2016 campaign. Hillary Clinton famously planted a dossier and used a dossier. And then in the 2020 election, we had similar allegations that the Hunter Biden laptop was foreign interference. And, you know, both of those claims were completely false, but I think they were actually less substantive than what we have here, which is an open admission that a foreign leader, an anti-Semitic foreign leader, is actively campaigning for somebody in the United States. And so our laws are pretty strict on these issues. They say that generally speaking, any foreign contributions are prohibited, and contributions can include all types of contributions. But what is unclear here is the extent to which Jeremy Corbyn is being compensated for his services. And as you mentioned to me, the advertisement, the flyer saying, "Come phone bank with Jeremy Corbyn," says paid for by the Mamdani campaign. Now that's under our laws probably making reference to the flyer being paid for. The open question is, to what extent there's compensation being given to Mr. Corbyn, first-class flights, you know, lavish entertainment, what have you. That might be illegal.
It's who's picking up the phone bill as well, because this is being coordinated from outside of the United States. You're going to have British political figures and presumably their supporters dialing in to phone up random New Yorkers and tell them how to vote.
Right.
We'll come back to Mr. Corbyn personally. In a moment, but where legally, what is the repercussions of that? Is it a matter of fines, or could this question, could this bring the whole integrity of the Mamdani's likely election victory tomorrow into question?
Well, I think both of those could be true. Integrity would be a political question. Fines would certainly be something that could be levied by our federal officials if that occurs. You know, there are already some questions about illegal contributions being made in that campaign. I think $13,000 worth or more than that. And so all of this usually shakes out months and years after the election. That's the problem, is that by the time the person is already elected, it's really a speed bump. It's a speeding ticket that they typically have to pay. People don't typically lose their ability to hold a position when they've committed massive campaign violations. In fact, Kamala Harris, as I pointed out on Tucker Carlson's podcast many years ago, last year actually, Kamala Harris got her start in elections by violating our election laws in California. She paid the fine, and she went on to become the vice president of the United States. So it didn't really hurt her career.
How does this leave Britain and America? I mean, President Trump has mentioned on a number of occasions in last year during his successful re-election campaign, he's upset that the Labour Party, who are the governing party in the United Kingdom, had essentially shipped hundreds of activists into swing states to try and influence the election, to try and get the vote out for Kamala Harris. A very angry response to that from the White House. When you read things like this, when you see British politicians trying to do this, how does that leave them with the administration? And has this been raised in Britain as unacceptable?
Well, you know, to use a British phrase, it isn't cricket to do this.
Okay. Very good.
And so it does impair our great relationship between the two countries. And then you add fuel to the fire. I mean, I'm in charge, among my many jobs in the DOJ, of anti-Semitism in our country. And I think it's kind of a disgraced foreign leader on top of that, who has actually been disciplined by his own party, suspended for 3 weeks in 2020.
And then expelled now. He's been expelled from the party. He's now an independent, and he's forming a new movement.
His own, like, Hamas, whatever. I mean, he famously called Hamas and Hezbollah friends.
Yes.
And that is quite terrifying to Jews and others who live in New York, who lived through 9/11. And so I'm not sure how these folks thought that through, but that imagery is quite disturbing for Americans.
On that point, Tim Shipman, you've got the scars on your back, as I have, of covering Jeremy Corbyn for the better part of a decade. Not the most helpful endorsement, is it, when you're trying to say to New Yorkers that you're not an extremist, you're not a crazy communist, and you're not a sort of terrorist sympathiser, you bring in the crazy communist terrorist sympathiser. I mean, it's kind of mad, right?
Well, I'm one of those guys who's got in his DMs messages from Jeremy Corbyn threatening to sue me for calling him anti-Semitic. So
Yeah, well.
I'm still waiting for the writ, to be perfectly honest. I mean, these things are always hilarious. The British left always screams blue murder if they think the Russians are trying to influence an election, but they love trying to do it themselves. You've mentioned what happened with Kamala Harris. We're now seeing this with Jeremy Corbyn. I remember back when the Guardian newspaper was whipping up its readers to phone people in swing states to say, will you please elect Barack Obama? I mean, if I was...
The letter-writing campaign in Ohio, I think that was against George Bush. I mean, that's going into the deep
If I was a
memories.
New York voter and I got a call from Jeremy Corbyn, I think I would pretty much rush out and vote for Andrew Cuomo just as a statement of intent, to be honest.
It doesn't bode well for for New Yorkers and the Mamdani's sort of sense of judgment, Assistant Attorney General, does it? In the fact that this guy is, as you said, completely disgraced. Do you think? Obviously, it's drawn a lot of attention overnight. You were quick to flag this as potential foreign interference. How do you think it's going to land with New Yorkers?
Well, look, I think New Yorkers are really in a tough spot. It looks like there are enough dumb, young, poorly educated people who are willing to go for somebody with the inflammatory views, in question. And we try to stay away from partisan politics in the DOJ, but it does concern me as an American, a former New Yorker. I lived in New York for many years. I started my legal career there. And so I think New York is in for a world of hurt coming up in this election.
It does strike me as a slightly, it's not exactly a great offering for New York, because a disgraced former governor who got a lot wrong in COVID, people argue, and then had to resign in disgrace, and then obviously Mamdani, and then if the Republican candidate had pulled out, perhaps there could have been a way of stopping him.
Yeah, like I said, we're trying to stay away from the partisan aspects of this, but I will say that we have a history recently with this foreign interference stuff, and it is resented by Americans. So
one of the things that strikes me as a relative newbie in this country is some of the revelations we've been hearing of not even foreign interference, but domestic interference in elections and domestic interference in politics. The Arctic Frost investigation that we are now learning from a series of whistleblowers and the House Oversight Committee. Hundreds of subpoenas, requested for phone records, for bank records, not just for politicians, which in itself is, a disgrace, but for journalists, for activists, for
lawyers.
For lawyers.
My law firm represented the president and represented the Republican National Committee, and is throughout these papers. So
how is it not outrageous. How is it not a bigger story? It kind of baffles me.
To use an analogy here, it is the tip of the iceberg, what we've just found out so far. I do think that a lot of rights have been violated. The United States Department of Justice is likely to be involved in this, and I'm also in charge of civil rights conspiracies at the Department of Justice, so I won't say more. But the allegations and the names and the extent, it disturbs me that American DOJ lawyers, fully educated, supposedly the top of their profession, knowing the importance of civil rights, the First Amendment, the legislative privileges in this country of the United States senators whose records were subpoenaed, willingly went along with this. It is really shocking to me.
I think it fell to AT&T or Verizon to turn around to the FBI and say, hang on, no, you can't have Senator Cruz's phone records.
That is because a federal judge banned those telecommunications providers from disclosing that information in a timely manner, which itself requires a showing to the court, which this court rubber stamped, that these senators were likely to somehow evade the production of their data, that they were dangerous. This is really, Ted Cruz, a noted lawyer, has been mentioned for the Supreme Court, to accuse him of, or Marsha Blackburn, to accuse these paragons of American privilege and society of presumption that they're going to destroy evidence is shocking and outrageous. And so heads need to roll, in my opinion, for this to never be repeated again in America. But again, we haven't even begun to touch the surface of the details.
I know you're slightly restricted in what you can say, but the House Oversight Committee are pushing for the DOJ to get involved in this. Here's the evidence. Now let's chase it. Is that your understanding? Will this be taken further? Can you likely see and be seeking prosecutions?
I would just say stay tuned. I can't speak on behalf of what we might do.
All right, let's go to New York. Thank you. Let's go to Tim. Sorry. In terms of the Arctic frost investigation, people are saying this is bigger than Watergate. It isn't getting the coverage I don't think it deserves. Can you imagine if it had been the other way around? If it had been the Trump White House and the Trump DOJ spying on Biden administration officials and Democratic senators, the hypocrisy of this is off the scale, right?
Yeah, I mean, welcome to politics. I mean, it's kind of,
I know, but it does strike me that we are
surprise me greatly.
slightly through the looking glass now, in that it seems that this pendulum swings back. Whoever's in power then spends the next 3 years, sort of dredging up this stuff, trying to lock each other up. But it's not very American in my view.
Yeah, this is happening here, but then you look back at home in London, and the very things that the Labour Party once criticised the Conservative Party for doing, they seem to be doing quite a lot of it themselves, and hypocrisy is a pretty regular theme in politics. But you can well imagine how the left would scream blue murder if this was being done to them.
That's a fair point. I mean, how are you guys going to bring this story to the prominence it deserves, given you seem to be up against pretty much every single major network who barely even mention it?
Well, every single major news cycle too. We have an election coming up. We have a lot of news there. We have the president with his foreign trip, and so many things happening. But our legal system works a little more slowly than the news cycles, and so I think people need to wait for us to get the evidence and catch up. We don't simply go out and arrest people overnight here in our country. We do our investigations. We submit our evidence. We have to have grand juries. If there's a criminal investigation, we have to get records. And so also on a separate track, I think there will be, probably cycles and cycles of this playing out in the news cycles, because there will be investigations over the next year initiated by the legislature themselves who were spied upon about this. And so I think there will be plenty of time to air this out and get to the bottom of it.
The age of lawfare doesn't seem to be going away. Mike Davis, a very pugnacious Republican.
Saw him earlier today. Good friend
good friend of the show. Pugnacious attorney says, look, two wrongs don't make a right, but it does make it even. I mean, is that now the mantra we're going to be in? Because say the Republicans lose the House in 2026, and then they're going to try and prosecute President Trump again. There'll be impeachment processes. The committees will flip and start investigating. Is there a point, or are we sort of past the point of no return now, where everyone can just sort of say, guys, let's do this at the ballot box rather than in the courtroom?
Yeah, I mean, the era of civility between the parties, which I think underpins some quaint practices like the blue slip process that Senator Grassley loves so much, that Mike used to work for him. I think that's a bygone era. It really went away during the Obama administration, and people are at each other's throats now. There's very little cooperation. John Fetterman is the only Democrat senator who is calling for the government to be reopened so that people can have their food and not pay astronomical Affordable Care Act premiums and so forth. So that we are the Department of Justice, however, not the Department of Getting Even. So
very good.
We will see how that goes.
President Obama was out and about not long ago. Last week, I think it was, making a similar sort of point to me of going, can we step back a little bit?
Oh, sure.
Should he? Yeah, exactly. Should he? Should he be worried?
That. No, I mean, I won't say he should be worried or not, but I will say it would be nice if we had more civility and predictability. It is not tenable for a society to constantly be. I mean, I hearken back when President Trump got indicted multiple times. It was really shocking to the conscience. It's the kind of thing you see in Pakistan,
Banana Republics, or France.
You don't see it in France. You don't see it in fully baked, well-functioning countries. We saw it in our country, and so it should never be repeated, in my opinion. That said, where lawyers, perhaps judges, certainly political operatives have violated the federal civil rights of American citizens, they should be held accountable for that.
Do you really think FBI agents that were sort of shaking down conservative activists who train Hill staffers in process and dragging them into this giant conspiracy that they're somehow involved in an insurrection that you could draw a line from Trump Tower down to the down to the grassroots of the party? Surely they didn't actually buy any of this stuff, right? It was a fishing trip.
look, again, we're talking about stuff that we're that is under investigation, and so we have to let that play out in the process. But the Department of Justice, my department, does indict law enforcement officials who violate people's federal civil rights. We do that at the state level. But when this happens at the federal level, there can be criminal conspiracy statutes brought to bear. I'm sure you've discussed these with Mike. And, I know I met with my boss earlier today, the Attorney General, and there's just a lot of stuff cooking right now we can't really talk about until it becomes public.
Excellent. We'll come back and see us when it is ready to cook. Stay there, guys. We're going to talk to Brandon Straka, founder of the Walk Away campaign, who's in the front line of the communist collapse of New York tonight. Good evening, Mr. Straka. How are you? Looks like it's game on for Comrade Mamdani, right?
It's been a hell of a fight. I've been in this now for about 5 months here in New York City, building what I believe to be the largest anti-Mamdani ground game to fight the socialist insurgency takeover of New York City. And tomorrow's the big day where the culmination of all the work that we've been doing here in New York City.
Are you confident it's going to be enough, though? I mean, he's looking pretty happy out and about campaigning this afternoon across New York. Looks like he's got this, isn't it?
Well, like I said, this has been an uphill battle from the beginning, and I didn't get involved because I thought it would be an easy fight. I thought it would be a really difficult fight, and it has been. But let me tell you, as I'm a former Democrat who walked away from the Democratic Party, and I joined the Republican Party about 7.5 to 8 years ago. And, I believe in fighting the radical left and not running away from a hard fight. So are the odds stacked against us? Of course they are. But let me tell you, there's some really encouraging signs that we're seeing here in New York City. One of them is early voting began on October 25th. That's last week. Early voting numbers are massively up, like 500% in certain boroughs. At this point, more than 735,000 people have come out to early vote. Now, in 2021, at this time, that was 169,000 people. And early polling is showing that the majority of those people who are coming out to early vote are over the age of 55. That's not Mamdani's base. So there are good signs right now that we're seeing a massive turnout in voting, unlike any other election. And it's possible a lot of these people are not coming out to vote for Mamdani.
So you're suggesting what you're seeing in the data is this narrative of young, dumb, kind of left-wing kids, rich kids, and coming out to, sort of vote like a turkey for Christmas. That's wrong, and actually there is a backlash against Mamdani.
Well, it's possible. I mean, look, so I think people got really freaked out because there was this upset in the primary where no one expected this guy to do so well and no one expected him to win. But the thing is, in our primaries here in New York City, we have this very stupid thing called ranked choice voting, which I won't get into because it's so complicated. We would need 3 hours to get through it, so I won't bore your audience. But we don't have ranked choice voting for our general election tomorrow. It's winner take all. So he was able to slide through in the primary, and he only got 430,000 votes or 460,000 votes in that primary. Typically, the winner of the New York City mayoral election needs to get about 780,000 votes to win. Now, that's in a normal election where we have normal numbers. Right now, we're seeing a 500% surge in voter turnout in this election. And I don't believe that the majority of those registered voters are going to come out and support this radical leftist, Marxist, socialist insurgency in New York City. I think people are going to come out and save New York City by voting. So, yeah, I'm optimistic. I'm going to stay optimistic.
Well, come back and see us again when we know the result tomorrow night. Just before you go, Brandon, can I get your response to the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who was kicked out of his own party for anti-Semitism, a man who called Hamas and Hezbollah his friends and has a long track history of palling around with terrorists, has been running a phone banking campaign for Mamdani from London. The legality and ethics of that aside, can I get your response to judging a man by the company he keeps?
Right. Well, very quickly, I'll say there's 3 pillars of Zohran Mamdani that concern me greatly. 1 are his policies, 2 are his rhetoric, and 3 is his radicalized base. So what I don't want to do is give the largest pulpit in New York City to a man who encourages radical left violence, anarchy, and obviously rubs elbows with terrorists. Let's not make this choice tomorrow. Let's defeat Zohran Mamdani.
Brandon Straka in New York, thank you for joining us. Best of luck.
Thank you.
He seems quite optimistic, Tim. I mean, it's it might not be doomsday just yet.
Well, this is an example of left populism, and there may be a parallel with the right populism at home. We had a by-election recently in Britain where it looked like the Reform Party were going to win it, and a lot of people turned out to stop that happening, whatever the rights and wrongs of that. On that occasion, it was a left-wing coalition against a populist right candidate. It looks here like you might be getting a lot of moderate New Yorkers turning out to try and back a radical left candidate. Populist candidates on left and right have done very well in recent years, but it looks a little bit like they then set themselves up as someone to shoot at. And in this case, that may be what's happening with Mamdani. I mean, Straka's right. The type of people who are turning out are older by the looks of it, and
So it made a lot of noise, but perhaps under the surface,
and that's often the way with radicalism.
Yeah.
The youth go for it, and then they make a lot of fuss, and then they don't necessarily always turn out in the numbers that they say they're going to.
That's right. Sometimes they're too disorganized to make it to the polls.
The left being disorganised. Who would ever have it? Harmeet, I know you need to. I know you don't want to stray too far into politics, but while you are here, obviously a major story in the United Kingdom and the United States, and we're going to be discussing this after the break with Tim. Before you go, can I just get your response to the disgrace of Prince Andrew, not least given that it seems to me that the Epstein files and the Epstein saga only really seems to be sort of dragging in Brits at the moment. It seems to be, well, the artist, the Andrew formerly known as Prince Andrew, now Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, an all but commoner by name, lost his titles, lost his home, lost his reputation. Arguably should have happened maybe a long time ago. Ghislaine Maxwell, a Brit, is the only person that seems to be jailed so far of this, beyond Epstein, who obviously didn't last long in prison. Won't ask you to comment on that. And Peter Mandelson, our former ambassador, packed off back to London after further relations from the Epstein files that have been handed over to Congress have come out. Is there more to come? Should Andrew, would you like to see Prince Andrew Mountbatten testify to Congress or help with your investigation?
Look, we don't have kings in our country, so I'm not going to.
249 years. We can let it go.
I'm not going to express an opinion about that. I mean, I would say we have our big holiday of Thanksgiving coming up, and I would say Thanksgiving will be awkward in the royal family this year if you were doing Thanksgiving, given the statement that the king made. Sex scandals are very common in your country. That's something that we do see in the headlines quite a bit. It's tragic for the victims of Epstein. I will just leave it at that. And I'm sure for the families, I saw some statements from the families to see accountability. I think is maybe some closure for them. That's all I will say.
Do you envisage a world, without revealing too much operational detail, of this not being the end of the legal road for Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, and he could potentially still be prosecuted in the United States?
I don't do the criminal side in the DOJ other than civil rights violations, and so it would be inappropriate for me to comment on that. All
right. Well, listen, in 20 seconds before you go, one final message back to London for anyone thinking about interfering in US elections.
Don't do it. You will not be welcome.
All right, then. Assistant Attorney General, thank you for joining us. Tim Shipman, stay there. We're going to be talking Epstein even more after the break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Harry Cole Saves the West. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, where you'll find all sorts of hidden gems and Easter eggs. You can watch the whole of my interview last week with Tucker Carlson, which has been going viral, as the kids say. Right, back to tonight. Members of Congress from both parties are now urging former Prince Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, which I'm getting very confused by saying, to testify as part of a renewed investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's global networks. They're calling his silence an insult to victims and demanding that he face questioning under oath. President Trump, meanwhile, says he feels sympathy for the royal family, calling it a terrible thing that's happened to them. But is the pressure mounting? And this time, Washington may not take no for an answer. Still with me is Tim Shipman, the political editor of The Spectator. Tim, I mean, he's lost his house, he's lost his titles, he's lost his dignity, he's lost his reputation, he's lost everything. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, hauled before Congress, would be the ultimate humiliation, wouldn't it?
Yeah, a lot of people would like to see him lose his freedom, frankly. I mean, what has emerged, the reason the king moved against him is not just because of some kind of medieval blood feud in the royal family.
But God, it feels like one, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, brothers move against their brothers. Andrew was the late Queen's favourite child, and that prevented a lot of this stuff from happening. But now it's his brother and his nephew ruling the roost, then he's in trouble. And the reason he's been kicked out is because a lot of what he claimed in the big public interview he did a few years ago has been disproved. He said he'd cut off contact, and more has emerged showing that he didn't. And clearly the victims would like him to testify. There are a considerable number of MPs back in Parliament in London who would like him to do that. And this is a guy who has basically ridden roughshod over every rule and every piece of propriety for years and years and years, and thinks that he's above the law. Well, now that he is no longer, the landed gentry, then he ought to be subjected to the same subpoenas and extradition rules as everybody else.
So if he could sweat, he should be sweating.
I think he definitely should be sweating.
Let's talk to Vicky Ward. Someone who's covered every cough and spit of this Epstein web for many years. Investigative journalist Vicky Ward. Well, good evening. What happens next for Prince Andrew? And as we were just discussing there, can you conceive a world in which he does get hauled into giving evidence either for the DOJ or for the congressional hearings?
Well, if you were a lawyer advising Prince Andrew, I think, as you've just pointed out, Harry, at this point, he's so down and out, what would be the upside for him in that? That would be my question. I think what you said earlier to your previous guest was interesting, that the people who seem to have paid a price for the Epstein files so far all seemed to be English. But I think you have to go back and remember the genesis of, Prince Andrew's fall here. And it was that BBC interview, because it was so tin-eared and because he didn't apologise to Virginia Giuffre. And I think, it emerges that he lied in it. And I think we were all appalled to read the private emails he was sending to Epstein after that, when he claimed that he'd broken off all contact, etc. And Sarah Ferguson's emails to Jeffrey Epstein saying, I didn't really mean when I said I was embarrassed, it was terrible to hang out with you. I didn't mean it. But I think, what I've always said about this case, it's a lot messier than people think it is. There are unquestionably other deals that have been done by American men behind the scenes, which has kept them conveniently out of court and out of the headlines. I don't think we've heard the end of this. Very interesting reporting coming out last week in both Bloomberg by Jason Leopold and in the New York Times by David Enrich, and it's all around the money trail. And what's so interesting about that is that the money at the end of the day is still the most overlooked part of this story. But without the money, Jeffrey Epstein could not have committed the sex crimes that he did. And so I think what we're getting closer to understanding, one, we learned last week that the leverage the government had over him in 2006 and 2007 was in fact that they were looking into money laundering, and they reached out to his then chief financial benefactor, Leslie Wexner, who we still haven't heard from. And it was the fear that the feds were going to go in further with this money laundering that led Epstein to actually plead guilty to the state charges, which, yes, in hindsight, we all think was a ridiculously
lenient deal cut back when. How long? What timescale would you put on us finding out these, finding revelations? We're obviously all waiting for the for the House Oversight Committee to publish the next tranches of their investigations. They say they're going through tens and tens of thousands of documents with a fine-tooth comb. Wouldn't it just be easier for the administration to go, you know what, let's just get it all out? Why do you think they're not?
It's a great question. It's a great question because, you know, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but from everything I know, from everything I've reported, President Trump is on the right side of history on this one. He cut ties with Epstein. He kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago. He was actually, of all the rich guys in Epstein's orbit, he was the one who was most helpful to Brad Edwards, the lawyer for Virginia Giuffre and for many of the victims. He talked to Brad Edwards twice. In one case, he said, "Don't bother subpoenaing me. I'll just phone you. I'll tell you whatever you want to know." So I think, and I know that Brad Edwards finds his reluctance on this, as baffling as I do. So, I honestly do not know what the reluctance is, but I do think that we are getting closer to holding the people who funded Jeffrey Epstein to account.
Conscious that we are live on television and somewhat legally restricted to what we can say, but is there any more flesh you can put on those bones of where and who those people might be?
Well, look, I've said this many times. We still don't know why Leslie Wexner, one of the richest men in this country, gave Jeffrey Epstein, who didn't graduate college, power of attorney. Okay, that is an extraordinary thing to have done. And we still don't have a reasonable answer as to why Leon Black, another of the richest men in this country, paid Jeffrey Epstein $170 million. And the plot thickens, Harry, because we also learned, again, with these documents that the Congress is going through, that Jeffrey Epstein sent an email to Leon Black telling him that Leon Black needed to pay him $40 million and that his children were, quote unquote, retarded, and that Leon Black's financial advisors were idiots. And Leon Black's response to this was to pay him tens of millions of dollars. Well, that's baffling.
Astonishing. Final question before you go, Vicky. It's one that I asked Peter Mandelson when he was on this show shortly before his defenestration from the British Embassy here in DC. He said to me he had no idea whether Epstein was actually killed himself or whether he was murdered. But someone so senior in the British establishment to open the door, frankly, to Epstein being murdered. Can I get your response to that? And what does your gut say?
Well, I think it's probably a very honest response. Jeffrey Epstein's own defense counsel, Reed Weingarten, also has no idea what really happened. I mean, Reed Weingarten told me that he met with Jeffrey Epstein the day before he died. Reed Weingarten believed that the non-prosecution agreement would hold, that he could really get Epstein out of prison, that he wouldn't have to face a trial. He said Jeffrey Epstein was smiling and seemed happy. And for a long time, Reed Weingarten has questioned what really happened. So it doesn't surprise me in the least that Peter Mandelson has questions. I think everybody does.
Vicky, well, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you very much. Still in the studio with me is Tim Shipman from The Spectator. We'll do Epstein murder in a moment, but let's get back to the politics of this. Not even in Britain, where the royal politics have been an extraordinary, saga. For Donald Trump, this is a guy, he put the Epstein files centre of his campaign. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, said, they're sitting on my desk, there's the list is on my desk, and then lo and behold, actually, no, it wasn't, then it is, and then it wasn't.
No list at all.
Exactly. The sort of screeching U-turn of full transparency. What do you think's going on? You're a man plugged into this town. Why have they done this U-turn?
Well, look, I think listening to Vicky, it sounds like Trump could make a perfectly plausible case that he had behaved appropriately here. But go back to what we were talking about in the first segment. Politics is so polarised, the two sides hate each other so much that literally anything linking Donald Trump to this case, any amount of new detail, regardless of,
which would have been
how much
story.
it exonerates him, is going to be absolute sort of, it's political nuclear weapons, isn't it? It's going to explode, and I can understand why. Actually, almost ironically, if he's sort of in the clear on it, that why would he sort of blow it all up again if he doesn't have to? Now, he may be forced to, I guess. This information may come out. But you can understand why they don't want to go and touch, the story that has become absolutely toxic. And it's just, but anybody... we're not going to get to the bottom of it unless we get these documents.
Well, yeah, I mean, tens of thousands of them have been turned over to Congress. They are making a very valid case that they do have to go through every single one of these for privacy reasons.
Yeah.
There's conflicting reports kicking around. That is there going to be more on Andrew? There is said to be more emails. Obviously, some of those emails have been published due to the mysterious availability of Jeffrey Epstein's private email account in whole, published on the dark web, which is where all this stuff is coming from. No prizes for guessing who put that there. But it's this drip is happening. Yet the palace are kind of steering to say actually it's not an expectation of anything more. To come. The line has already been
crossed. I mean, he's already been proven to be a liar categorically in public, and that was enough. And when the king was already of the view that this was embarrassing to the royal family long before he became the king, and then since he became the king, we got all this new evidence that Andrew, is not only dumb as a brick, but has also lied publicly about his situation.
And a dumb and a nasty piece of work by all accounts as well. How much damage do you think this has done to the monarchy, to the house, actually to the monarchy itself, and to the House of Windsor as part of that monarchy? Your rival magazine back in Britain, the New Statesman, wrote a very fiery piece about this. This is justification for sort of bringing down the monarchy. Obviously, they will use any excuse to Republicans will use any excuse to do that. But how much damage has been done to the brand Windsor and to the actual concept of the monarchy?
Well, look, I think the monarchy is fairly enduring. The reason the King and the Prince of Wales acted in this way is precisely because they want to preserve the monarchy and they want to preserve the reputation of the House of Windsor and show that they're doing the right things. Our monarchy has been through many worse scandals and occasions than this.
I'm not sure. I mean, in modern times.
If you go back centuries, Harry, I mean, they were all killing each other and usurping each other, and we had an abdication, within our sort of recent lifetimes.
But with that one, he was still entitled to keep the title of the Duke of Windsor. He was still entitled to keep royal sort of airs and graces. He wasn't, yes, he was sort of banished from the land, but he was sent to the Bahamas to be the governor. If it is able, with a flick of a pen, for the king to revoke the divine right of his little brother to be, he's still in the order of succession.
But that's the thing. He hasn't revoked the divine right. He's taken away all his titles. He's still eighth in line to the throne.
The problem is,
if there's some hideous crash, they won't all be getting on a plane together. The other 7, will they?
Does it undermine the concept of hereditary monarchy if the king can just go around and knock that goes out?
I think it will undermine that for people who already have a problem with it. But the monarchy has ridden through many crises. I mean, even in going back through Charles's lifetime, the divorce from Princess Diana was a big deal, and that if you look at the polling, that rocked public support in the monarchy more than this has done. And I think they've precisely acted to try and prevent further damage. And I think if you look at the polls, I think most people think they've done the right thing. So it's embarrassing, of course it is, but I don't think that this is fundamentally undermining the principles of the thing.
My suspicion is they're not done yet. I suspect the Sandringham estate is not going to be the end of the saga. I suspect it ends with him exiled.
Well, I'd be very surprised if he lived in Britain again. And frankly, if the king could put him on a plane to a US courtroom, I suspect he would do so.
All right, stay there, Tim. We've got lots more to discuss after the break, including a bit of BBC bashing. Don't go anywhere. Well, back to Harry Cole Saves the West. Hit subscribe on YouTube. You will not regret it. The Spectator's Tim Shipman is still with me here. Now, a story rocking back in Britain. The BBC is in the dock tonight after leaked documents reveal its flagship programme, Panorama, edited Donald Trump's January the 6th speech to make him look like he encouraged a riot. Have a look at this.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
He added there peacefully as well. Cut out. Tim Shipman, you're a man that's, edited tens of millions of words for your Brexit tomes. And, a long distinguished career in journalism, you can edit a quote down to make it fit. But if you fundamentally change the meaning of the quote or make it look sexier, which I argue that clip does, you're into dangerous ethical ground, aren't you?
Yeah, and if you ever edit a quote for length to keep the more interesting bits in, you should be putting dots in it to show that you have done so. Now, you can't do that on television, but I mean that, I think Trump's speech taken as a whole that day, it's perfectly reasonable to have a view that he was egging something on rather than trying to calm it down. But that is a bald-faced, unethical practice, what happened there. It's not what he said. And, I think if you're going to make the argument that he was encouraging something, you need to show the whole clip.
It's not
simple as that.
It's BBC, we'll come to BBC in a moment, but just in terms of the unhelpfulness of this to, saving the West, to the special relationship. You've got Don Jr., Trump raging about this all day. The White House is saying they're looking into this. The BBC, it's not like what... They are publicly funded. They are, in the Americans' minds, they're meant to be the sort of impartial, untouchable sort of bastion of news. We obviously, having lived in Britain, we have different versions. Recollections may vary, you might say. But they do have a responsibility not to cock this stuff up.
Yeah, no, totally. And they've got into trouble quite a bit recently.
Yeah.
There was a documentary in Gaza where it turned out that they were quoting people, poor, impoverished children who just happened to be the son of, a minister in the Hamas government, which was not revealed until later.
Just mind-blowing.
Look, at some level, the Beeb can be undone by unethical practice from, one or two people in its ranks or in the production company that's producing the thing that they've hired.
Yeah.
But at the same time, because of their international reputation, and let's go back to, the days of sort of tyranny in Eastern Europe and those kind of places, the BBC was supposed to be the sort of impartial clarion call. If you were listening to the BBC in a country that was living under a dictatorship, you were getting the unvarnished view rather than the propaganda that was being pumped out by your own state broadcasters. And the problem here is that, the Beeb is, much beloved in Britain, but at the same time, it does have a kind of culture of middle-of-the-roadism that leads a lot of the people who work for it to think that they're doing the Lord's work by exposing what they think of as nasty people.
This isn't journalism, this is activism, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
Even the fact that the airing of that Panorama documentary that has now been shown to have been spliced and diced, that was on the eve of the US elections. I didn't see a documentary about how useless and incompetent Kamala Harris was.
No, and we saw it at home with Brexit and Boris Johnson's premiership, and now, in the States with this, 2 terms of Trump. These people drive a lot of folk on the sort of centrist, liberal, libertarian, the sort of the progressive left completely balmy, and it means that they lose, their sort of faculties. They seem to think that it's legitimate to depict them in a certain way.
Trump derangement syndrome, you might call it.
Exactly.
Tim Davie, BBC, just finally on this one, Director General of the BBC, seems to be like a cat with 9 lives. I reckon he's up to like 7 or 8 of them now. There've been, as you said, so many of these scandals. How do you clean this up? How do you root this stuff out without it doesn't seem to be chopping and changing Director General here and there. It doesn't seem to be doing the trick.
No, and anyone who knows Tim Davie knows that he's a man gently of the right rather than of the left, and actually it's sort of ironic it's sort of dropped into his lap. But lots of people who've worked there will say that there's not a sort of overt politicisation at the BBC, but there's a sort of casual, unthinking, young, lefty kind of progressivism that doesn't really wear political colours, but is just sort of it's a sort of soppy, establishment view of people who've come to challenge. And in this day and age, populist leaders are doing very well by talking about what they think the public really wants to talk about. And if Mamdani does win in New York, it's actually because he talked about rent and about the cost of living and buses and stuff that people care about.
Nationalising
most of those people who are voting for him are probably not, communists or Marxist-inspired theoreticians. They're people who want things to be a bit cheaper and to get more buses. But this is what Donald Trump did very well here. It's what the Brexit campaign did very well in Britain, is to actually energise people around what they want. And a lot of the people who've done very well out of globalisation and out of mass migration and all of that, they just instinctively don't like it. They think it's, they think it's wicked. And as a result, they put aside, a bunch of professional kind of pledges that they've made about how they should behave because they think it's justified to try and tell a particular story about some of these people. And, President Trump sometimes makes that too easy for them, as I think he probably did in that speech on that day. But to edit it in that way is entirely unethical.
Very good. Let's move on. Elon Musk says that Britain faces civil war unless it stops importing voters via mass migration. He made an extraordinary comparison that Britain are like the hobbits in the Shire, protected by the hard men of Gondor out in the West, and actually are living in a sort of, have been living in a delusion and are now waking up to the horrors of mass migration. We talked about foreign interference in the US elections, and obviously Elon Musk is no longer a member of the US administration, but he has got a remarkable level of influence over British politics at the moment. I mean, his intervention on the grooming gangs back in very early January of this year sort of, for the first time, sort of distilled that story into 1, 2 or 3 weeks of boiling rage and anger. That eventually it led to a promise from the government of an investigation into the rape gangs, but still trying to get that up and running. On the right, particularly, the Reform were flirting with Musk a little bit. Rupert Lowe, the MP, has got he's funding Tommy Robinson's legal challenges left, right, and centre, and politicians like Robert Jenrick on the Tory side, Katie Lamb, they're saying stuff that even a year ago you wouldn't have been able to. Do you think it's a helpful, and again on the ethics of it, this is the world's richest man using his train set platform to basically conduct and change, and intervene in politics of a different country?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's been hugely influential, and I think he's moved, that Ponzi phrase that lots of people in politics use, the Overton window, the sort of what is kind of acceptable to say. He has stretched that quite a bit and certainly shifted it to the right. And you're right, there's a lot of mainstream politicians who now parrot what he says. Interestingly, when he first talked about the grooming gangs, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, basically said, I'm not interested in that. It's all being got up by the hard right. But actually, in the end, he was forced to go along with it. They're obviously dragging their feet now because they don't really want to do it in an effective way. But Musk. But look, I think there is always a danger when big foreign figures start throwing their weight around. Yeah. People instinctively don't like being told what to do by people from elsewhere.
Barack Obama, back of the queue if you vote for Brexit, didn't like that.
That's the case I was about to say. I mean, when Obama agreed to do that, the then Prime Minister David Cameron and his Chancellor George Osborne were cock-a-hoop. They were absolutely delighted. They thought, this is brilliant. Everyone loves Obama. He'll tell us this. And it turned out most voters in Britain didn't want to hear that from Barack Obama. They thought that was pretty outrageous. And, I think the general view is that fueled votes for Leave in the end. And, I think a lot of people look at Musk. They don't like the influence he's got. They think he's staring at all their social media messages. He's probably got better things to do. But I think there's not that Musk will care. He can have his influence. Yeah. And there's a lot of people in the world. I mean, I've been in DC for only 24 hours on this visit, but I've already spoken to a lot of people who say, there are a lot of people in and around Trump who kind of really have a kind of atavistic love of Britain,
Yeah,
and
no,
a sense of the old-fashioned values, the rule of law, Parliament, all that stuff going back, and they almost feel like Britain is itself throwing away those
Exactly.
values.
This has been a long-running theme of the show, is that actually the Americans, it's out of a love of a weird way.
You see that with J.D. Vance. You see it with people like Sebastian Gorka. You see it,
the late Charlie Kirk speech to the Oxford Union. I often cite England is America's mother. And in fact, they took a lot of great things we did and ran with them and made them better, arguably. Well, on J.D. Vance, obviously he sort of he got a lot of backlash in. I think it was March, was it, when he did his Munich speech about free speech in Britain, about free speech in Europe, and the old country and the old world sort of forgetting the values they put in. There was a big backlash in Britain about it, but then actually since then. There was a lot of shouting at the time, but now actually we're talking about free speech in a way that we weren't before. The Metropolitan Police are coming out and saying, you know what, we're not going to do any more of these non-crime hate incident forms that see 12,000 people with a sort of weird sort of Orwellian piece of paper from the state telling them they've been a very naughty boy, but they're not going to go to prison. I mean, the window, you're right, has moved. And it has been, you can argue that it has been helpful for, the boy in the Emperor's New Clothes to just go, what is going on?
Yeah, and it sometimes takes someone from outside to really identify it and to spot it. Because whenever there's creeping change in a country, it's a bit, it's the old boiling a frog analogy. You maybe don't necessarily notice these things evolving. It puts a lot of people's noses out of joint, but sometimes they feel that they can't say it. And collectively, people sometimes, it feels like the people complaining are a bit cranky. But when someone from outside comes in who's got a proper platform and a bit of clout and says, hang on a minute, this is completely nonsensical, I think it does allow people to step back and say, should we really be doing this? And actually, but I think the benefit then is in, the politicians of that country then getting to grips with it as to a degree they have at home, and rather than sort of Musk continuing to bang the drum and interfere all the time. On
a final point on that, I mean, obviously, I think Donald Trump has publicly said he gave Keir Starmer a massive kicking all the way around of Scotland and Windsor over our suicidal economic policy. Very quickly, in 20 seconds, Tim, do you think the British government are going to move on any of that? There seems to be a slight softening on net zero.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they understand that that is a policy that is dragging them to penury, but they're in a very difficult position, and the left of their party is asserting itself in a quite.
Yep. All right, on that note, sorry to cut you off there, Tim Shipman, that was all we've got time for tonight. See you tomorrow.